My friends here on the channel. Yes, I'm calling you my friends. We don't talk, we don't hang out, but there's a bond there, right? I'm not making that up. Even if I am, I have to start my video somehow, and usually I'm just kind of like floundering and at a loss for a good intro that really just hooks you. So here it is. You may or may not know, depending on how much you frequent this YouTube channel or how much I get to talk about it, but I'm a pretty big FromSoft fan. I played pretty much all of their modern releases. I haven't touched like Armored Core and maybe like King's Field. That's another one of theirs, I believe. I haven't really touched those. Beginning all the way back with Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls. Now, if you think about that, that's kind of hard to say. It's singular possessive, and it doesn't really make much sense, nor is it really easy to say without messing it up. Demon's Souls, Demon's Souls, Demon's Souls? The Demon's Souls? It's a demon's soul? But with all that in mind, one of my biggest gaming blind spots here was Sekiro. Shadows die twice. Not once, twice. Now, I'm here to report to you that I finally played it, but not only that, I platinumed it. And I gotta say, what a great experience. I really don't know what kind of drugs I was on that made me not play this game for so long. But now I have written that wrong. I righted that wrong. And I'm here to tell you about my experience. I knew I'd get there eventually. So I'll say this. If you like discussion-based video game content, my dumb face, or you just discovered YouTube for the first time in 2023, subscribe. Or I mean, what else you gotta do for however long this video is. I will say this, usually with FromSoft games, you can kind of pick up from your last FromSoft game or your last Souls game that they've made and really take it from there. But this game I was terrible at. I just didn't understand how to parry or do any of that stuff, so it took some getting used to in comparison. In other Souls games or even Souls-like games, you generally need to learn some of the basics of parrying, blocking, and dodging, their various mechanics, the timing of which usually in these games you get used to after a time. And it isn't until you fight some of your first boss battles in those games you kind of really get a grasp on how things work. In Demon's Souls, and then Dark Souls 1 and 2, your general goal, with kind of slight exceptions and variants depending on what your build is to be more defensive. Play it a little slower. Look for ways you can exploit openings and block or dodge attacks. Bloodborne and later Dark Souls 3 employed more aggressive tactics, aggressive gameplay tactics, especially with Bloodborne. You had to be quick to react and to counterattack. Then comes Sekiro like a wrecking ball. It asks you to time your attacks and be patient. And time your block so you can parry and counterattack. It asks you to investigate to find different ways to break enemy stagger and posture. In this way, it allows Sekiro to be a bit more directed and focused on you playing a certain way. And while there's certain flavors of how you can fight bosses or enemies, the end result always ends up kind of the same or similar, which is block, parry, break posture, dodge, but you have to remain aggressive. That's something I realized early on. You have to remain aggressive. Otherwise, you can easily lose your footing. And it's really difficult at first like that. Even as a Souls fan, I have played and beaten all of these games and even at the platinum in most of them, but for Sekiro, it was different. It had me getting my ass whooped over 24 times by Genichiro on my first playthrough, only to be so familiar with him by my third, I was killing him on the first try. Oh, and yeah, I did end up playing the game like 3 times. Why? Because I'm an insane person and I really needed that platinum trophy, man. I had to get it. I mean, look at that shit. Come on. I had to. Now I gotta say this. Well, first off, come a little closer. The gameplay is pretty fucking fire. Once you get that rhythm down, it really is a cliche to say it, but it does honestly feel like a bit of a dance. Early game enemies are simple, as they're slow and they don't provide much of a challenge, but you encounter your first mini-boss, and I was actually a bit confused. What is actually going on here? I calmed myself down, and then I got back into the fight. Okay. Here we are. You have attacks you'll always need to dodge, but there are certain perilous attacks here that are signified by this red kanji, a word that I did look up for the sake of this video, and isn't that pretty wholesome? You'll learn something new. Who says you can't learn anything on the tubes of you? But you can learn certain abilities to avoid them, so you'll dodge or try to parry attacks which build up a posture meter. You also have one, which when maxed out allows you to stagger the enemy and perform a death blow, or they can do the same to you, which depending on the enemy will either be an instant kill, or for bosses or most bosses and mini bosses, bring them down to 1 health bar, which allows you to your next death blow to be the killing one. So in a way, it's kind of like this tense match of trying to get those posture bars down, and there's usually more than one way to do it. And that's why I said you often have to really figure out how you're going to do this. Now, maybe you only have like really one way to play the game in a sense, but in actuality, you have a few different flavors is kind of the best way I can describe it. With your prosthetic tools, it lets you grapple around, use a secondary weapon like an axe or firecrackers, umbrella, a short poison blade, and much more. You have general use items too, like oil to coat your enemies so you can use the fire tool on them, or you can use things that buff your posture, attack power, or health, or maybe use the firecracker to stun an enemy for a brief period of time so you can get in a couple hits. There's just so many ways you can kind of go about it, even if it is roughly different flavors of the same kind of way you're playing. I think it provides you with enough tools to keep that combat engaging, because we may end up using the same methods. You and I are always going to use the sword, the samurai sword, that katana, but we're going to go about it different ways. You may find a different way to fight the game's various bosses than I did. Maybe you'll find a way to just kind of brute force them, but you always have the same goal, to stagger that boss or that enemy and perform a death blow. Occasionally you can even sneak up around a mini boss and perform a stealth death blow, rendering them weaker at the beginning of a fight, which can be a godsend depending on how much health you have. So in that, I kind of was shocked. I was like, wow, there's a lot more here than meets the eye. There's a lot of curveballs thrown your way there that keeps you strategizing and thinking. I'll give you an example. Lady Butterfly's second phase has her casting illusions that attack you, and right before that fight, you get snap seeds from a dying man to snap those illusions away. Or you can use Divine Confetti to buff your damage against regular enemies and apparition type enemies, mixed with Akko Sugar to buff your base damage, then maybe top it off with some pacifying agents so you don't get absolutely terrified and die like I do almost every day of my life. It makes for a much deeper game than what appears at the outset. You're not just blocking and parrying, but finding items to give you just a small advantage in gameplay. Discovering them yourself or finding a guide online that helps you discover them is a rewarding loop that always made the game, or always made turning on the game, more interesting for me. Most bosses are offering you prayer beads to kind of give you more health and posture increases. Beating main bosses lets you unlock a memory, which kind of invokes this kind of memory where you have to confront it and it increases your attack power. Of course, if you're going for that platinum trophy, you'll have to do this either way. But for those that just want to make sure they're prepared with all the stat upgrades, it provides that kind of incentive you wouldn't have otherwise to go back and try to find all the bosses, all the mini bosses that may be in the game. Something that separates a lot of games from the pack for me is if the gameplay is engaging. I mean, that's what it is anyway. At the end of the day, gameplay is king. But what I mean by that is I never feel burnt out upon either multiple replays or even doing simpler tasks or similar tasks throughout. I use Ghost of Tsushima when I talk with my friends about this, for example, where the gameplay and the sword play in that game is just so much fun. I never get bored just going around and just fighting enemy camps. Same thing in Spider-Man. A game like Spider-Man and Ghost of Tsushima, both games just have those addicting gameplay loops that burnout comes in the form for me with those games in the span of like, I've been sitting in front of my TV for 10 hours, maybe I should take a break, but never any other reason. Sekiro never felt like a grind for me. Even the platinum trophy hunt did not feel like a grind, except for kind of getting every skill point in the game. That was a little grindy, but you get my point, I hope. Replaying this game allows you to try different encounters in different ways if you choose to, and it also allows you to approach areas in slightly different manners given the amount of verticality and the ways you can traverse these levels. And that's something that I always gush over in games, is when it has the verticality, but I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Another thing notable about Sekiro is how it tells its narrative. While it's a bit more direct than a normal FromSoft game, it still is kind of vague and mostly told through lore tidbits that you find through the game and vague conversations you have with the different characters. That really was the part that stood out to me, is more so that it had cutscenes and dialogue and whatnot, or more dialogue I should say. Not necessarily the story itself, it didn't really stand out to me too much beyond that, but that was pretty interesting. You have that whole plot, of course, with the Divine Heir wanting you to help them sever the ties of immortality, which, being a gameplay mechanic, when you do die in Sekiro, you usually get revived and you have a second chance, and later maybe even a third or even a fourth chance to come back. It lets you take a little risk at first in gameplay and you otherwise wouldn't, and you think of ways you can maximize upon it. I think about how I strategize my revives, for example, when I fought Genichiro. If I went down during the first phase of the fight, I often would just give up and kind of let myself die and try the fight again, because when you get a death death blow, you recharge your revives instantly. But if I went down during the second phase, it allowed me to then get a death blow on him to move into the third phase, and then in that third phase, I had a revive ready to go and stored up just in case he got me. So in that way, it kind of forces you to kind of strategize and figure out ways you can maximize the amount of revives you have. But again, beyond that, I didn't really find myself super engaged in the story beyond the fact that I thought it was cool that they kind of worked in the story, or kind of like the mortality into the story, which is also a gameplay mechanic. That driving force of the story is that the divine heir wants to sever the ties of immortality. This simple setup, and again, just wasn't engaged in it. I'm not sure that I knew what was going on the whole time. I don't know if that's just because I've gotten older and I'm getting a little crotchety here. I'm just kind of like, I don't even know what's going on here. But this is simply by design, because FromSoft is usually more apt, from what I've played of their games, to give you a more engrossing cycle of medium to hard enemy encounters and challenging boss battles that serve as your line of progression, your through line for the game. It's a familiar cycle at this point, but one that they have proven time and again is not going to lose any steam if they have anything to say about it. Last thing on the narrative though, I will say, is that I think like when Elden Ring was nominated for Best Narrative at the Game Awards, a lot of people scoffed and smirked, myself included at one point, believing that the game didn't really have a narrative to speak of. And while it's inarguable that the game does not always prioritize story in the way of straightforward cutscenes that clearly outline your goals, the characters, the driving force of the game's many bosses, and what's going on generally, it's also inarguable that if you just read about the game's world and you look into its deep layers, you'll find often dark and moving stories, and even tragic endings for some characters who were just twisted by the demented forces of the world that have sealed their fate. So in that, the same is true for Sekiro. It's a little bit more direct than Elden Ring or Souls games of past, but it's not gonna have you scratching your head wondering, what is this all about? It has a different kind of approach. But as with most of their games, you can engage with it as much or as little as you like, which is probably the biggest positive I can say about any of the story in any of their games, is that you can care about it if you want, or look into it if you want, but if you just think it's a kick-ass video game, you just want to play it, that's awesome too. It's a great game. And here in Sekiro, it's the promise of immortality. It's twisted the land and the people defending it to the point where there's an abundance of bosses, or mini-bosses, or even enemies just doing what they believe is right here, and serving Ashina to the best of their ability, not knowing that they've been twisted by that immortality that they just can't let go of. Where the wolf, who you play as, or Wolf, has one goal beyond everything, and that's to defend and protect the divine heir, and maybe breaking that iron code that he swore to uphold by severing the ties of immortality. It has some twists and turns, not much that I really got too deep into, and we have all we need to drive us through. I was really surprised, however, about how much I liked this aesthetic of this game, and the world design, and how in its environments and its bosses and enemies, it tells its narrative. Again, you will either engage with it or you won't. Either way, the game is still great. One of the last things I want to talk about with Sekiro is how it has a deceptive amount of content that I was not prepared to witness. If you just mainline this game, like you know exactly where to go and when, which does make your path much more difficult since you'll probably miss items, skills, and stat upgrades, I would wager or guess you could probably beat the game in about, I don't know, 10 to 15 hours maybe, give or take, assuming that you're just fighting main bosses. But you'd miss the amount of content that is here on full display. There's deep valleys and cliffs you can travel through, and pools of poison, an entire castle complex you can grapple around to your heart's content, and I think that should be in every game, a grappling gun or hook or whatever. It's no wonder Elden Ring captured that excitement for me and sense of discovery and wonder forward, because Sekiro has that similar feeling, albeit on a slightly smaller scale, and just when you think you've seen everything. Turns out there's a whole new area accessed by a secret elevator, and it's a night and day difference from the rest of the game's areas. Or there's a turn you miss in a tunnel that acts as a shortcut to another area. They always have that sense of discovery in their games, and Sekiro is just an extension of that and further Elden Ring. Furthermore, you may beat bosses. Like I would beat bosses and they would end up in another location to fight again, providing a little bit of a different challenge and another opportunity for me to get stat increases. I mentioned this earlier, but I am a sucker for verticality in video games. I love it, love it, love it. The grappling around, the depth of these levels, having an entire boss fight dedicated to just grappling out of harm's way when necessary. My God, like, what a fucking brilliant gameplay loop here. I don't know. It's just such an addicting cycle of gameplay. I've never been in my glory than I am in playing this game. I am sorry about my language, of course. No, not really, but I'm sorry because I'm not. Actually, I'm not. You know what? Fuck this. I'm not. It's incredible. And if you haven't played this game, this is why I'm making this video. I'm making it for you. You have to play it. On top of that, there's multiple endings. One of which ends the game pretty early, but not in like one of those fake ways where it's a joke ending and the game reloads and it's like, haha, just kidding there, buddy. We're not really over. You gotta do this again. And the other endings that give you access to a whole other area of the game. And it's not just like that, oh, here's an endgame type area where you can kind of walk around a bit and it's only like 20 minutes long. It's a whole other area with stuff to uncover, quests to do, characters to meet and to talk to. Did I also mention that there's different bosses on the two different branching paths? Maybe not drastically different, but they are different. And it changes the state of Ashina Castle. So there's different paths and enemies and bosses to fight. And I can imagine getting that one ending where you're blocked off in that final area. Maybe you're playing the game ignorantly, which is the best way to play a game like this if you can, and you could still get through. Imagine playing that and you didn't see that whole last area. Your game just ended early. It's crazy to think that you would miss something in this game like that, a whole other area. My instinct is that most people are going to play the game where they're going to get that area, but just imagining someone who's maybe just a little more ignorant on the game is maybe going to play it that way. I don't know. If you're trying to experience everything though, it can take quite a long time. And I'm saying this as someone who played the game for about 70 hours, all things considered. On the surface, you may think there's not that much content here. How did you play for 70 hours? But if you dig into the game, there's just so much there. It makes continuing to uncover and discover everything rewarding every time. Makes that little difference every time. The little quests you can embark on, it's worth letting it all just wash over you. I was never bored, even on multiple playthroughs. I love this game for that. Something too I didn't even dive into in this update or this version of the game or this game is that they allow you to fight bosses and even do a boss rush mode in the Game of the Year update. So what I'm telling you here is that there's just so much here. Add to that one last thing I was not expecting. The ability to swim. Usually in their other games or in games past, you just swim or try to swim, you fall to your death. But there's not only the ability to swim here, you get these massive underwater areas that you can just explore, and even little mini bosses you can fight underneath that water. That's insane. Come on. So that was the biggest thing. Sekiro has a shocking amount of content in it. It's just shockingly deceptive with the amount of content. You could play it once, think like, oh, that was a pretty good, but there's little things here and there. And no, it doesn't have to be 100 hours to have a lot of content, but it has meaningful content or enjoyable content. Something I have appreciated with all of FromSoft games in the last decade is that you can see the progression of things they're learning across all of their games. Their latest, in Elden Ring, being what some would consider, and myself included, their magnum opus, if you will. But it's clear now how necessary and brilliant a game like Sekiro needs to be in order to even slightly achieve a game like Elden Ring. It didn't come from nowhere. It didn't come overnight. Now, some of you have sought to educate me on Armored Core as of late. Like, seriously, if you look at my Armored Core video about the first details, some of you really just tore me a new one on that one. That was fantastic. Love it. Armored Core is also part of that legacy, and also part of what I think they'll take from whatever they think makes sense from Sekiro, Elden Ring, and Souls, and kind of put that in Armored Core. And I know I say that, and some people are like, yo, what the f, bro, you can't do that. What I'm saying is that the things that they've learned, the things that you liked, if it works, they will probably take that into every game that they make. With that, I just want to say thanks for stopping by and watching this video and hearing me just gush over Sekiro. I am sorry that it took me this long to play it, and I'm sorry if this isn't the most current of content, but I'm glad I did play it, and now I leave the conversation in your hands. Did you like the game? Yet to play it, and you're intrigued now? Am I wrong in any way? I mean, I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. Like, comment, subscribe, do whatever. Enjoy your life. Truly enjoy your life. And thanks again. You really just have nothing else better to do than to sit on that end screen and just wait for the video time to run out, do you? If you did that for any other YouTuber, I would say, what the hell is wrong with you? But since it's me, I really respect you for the effort. Not many people have that kind of charisma and energy. I bet you're gonna pick one of the two videos on the screen now because you're gonna watch it because you're way better than your peers. I knew I liked you when you decided to watch my video while in the middle of ordering at a Dairy Queen. You're going places.